This is the first of two presentations on John Locke, who lived from 1632 to 1704. In addition to writing philosophy, he was a medical doctor, he was an aficionado of the science of his time, and he was an advisor to Anthony Ashley Cooper, the first Earl of Shaftesbury. Although Locke is well known as the inspiration for the political ideals of America's founders, most notably Thomas Jefferson, for our purposes, his most revolutionary ideas were presented in a large book published in 1690, an essay concerning human understanding. If you skim the pages of our book's excerpts from the essay, you'll notice that it's broken into four major books, each having a number of chapters, and that these chapters are broken up into sections. This is actually quite a helpful organization because Locke tends to use each section to make an independent argument for one of his major points. In addition, you'll notice that after each section number and at the beginning of the section itself, there's a sentence in italics that gives a brief summary of what that section is about. You might want to pause at this point to flag the following key passages in the first part of the essay. These passages will help us understand how and why Locke rejects rationalism and will introduce us to his theory of ideas. This theory will be the basis upon which every later empiricist will build. In this course, those figures will include Bishop George Berkeley and David Hume, and to a certain extent Immanuel Kant as well. Before we start examining these key passages, a little background. We've already talked about the sense in which Descartes, Spinoza, and Leibniz were interested in science and how their notion of scientific proof was tied to deductive logic and the old Aristotelian sense in which you would demonstrate a conclusion. You'll remember that this was particularly obvious in Spinoza's geometrical or axiomatic approach to philosophy. Locke is the first major thinker, however, to use Francis Bacon's new inductive method of reasoning. Induction and empiricism grew up on the same street, we might say. In addition to generalizing from particulars, empiricists like Locke often make use of experimental thinking, in which they test their intuitions against possible cases. Look for evidence on both of these in what we're about to study. One more point. Whereas rationalists like Leibniz saw philosophy as providing a needed foundation for the pursuit of good scientific knowledge, Locke had a very different view. In areas such as physics and medicine, the 16th and 17th centuries had proven to be a fruitful time in the creation of new theories that took issue with the medieval reliance on ancient authorities like Aristotle and Galen. And in many ways, scientists like Robert Boyle and René Descartes were radicals in overthrowing ways of thinking that had stood for nearly 2,000 years. At the beginning of Book 1, Locke both gives his purpose for us and defines epistemology for us. He says his purpose is to inquire into the origin, certainty, and extent of human knowledge, together with the grounds and degrees of belief, opinion, and assent. Locke makes it clear, though, what he is not interested in, what we would call doing metaphysics. He says, "I shall not at present meddle with the physical consideration of the mind, or trouble myself to examine in what its essence consists, or by what motions of our spirits or alterations of our bodies we come to have any sensation by our organs, or any ideas in our understanding, and whether those ideas do, in their formation, any or all of, depend on matter or not." In other words, Locke will give us the why, but not the how, of how we get truth and knowledge. Why not do metaphysics, though, as Descartes, Spinoza, and Leibniz were happy to do? Well, it all comes down to Locke's attitude toward the relationship of science and philosophy. According to him, philosophy must serve as the handmaiden to science, sweeping the intellectual ground in front of scientific progress from the old and outdated ideas, so that scientists can do their job. Notice how different this is from the idea of philosophy as providing the foundations upon which truth and certainty rest. Now here, what are the central notions of Locke's empiricism by taking a look at the key passages in the early part of the essay, starting with Book 1, Chapter 2, sections 1 through 14. Since this part of the essay is Locke's refutation of innate ideas, let's take just a minute to recall what innate ideas are. An innate idea would be Descartes' cogito, or Spinoza's definitions, or Leibniz's primary truths. Innate ideas are something we're born with, they're true a priori, they can't be justified by a more basic idea, they are not trivial, that is, they state a knowledge claim, and they provide a foundation of certainty for empirical knowledge. Here we see that Locke defines them as innate principles, some primary or common notions, characters, as it were, stamped upon the mind of man, which the soul receives in its very first being and brings into the world with it. However, Locke doesn't so much think that there aren't innate ideas as he thinks that if there were, we wouldn't need them in the first place. He says that if he can show how men, barely by the use of their natural faculties, may attain to all the knowledge they have without the help of any innate impressions, then he will have demonstrated this for us. So most of this part of Book 1, Chapter 2 is a series of arguments that empirical data can supply our knowledge without having to assume that we have innate ideas. There are actually a number of these arguments, and these have been helpfully cataloged and named by Stephen Priest. They are the argument from general agreement, the argument from unconscious knowledge, from the capacity to acquire knowledge. Further, there's the argument from the use of reason, that from instant recognition, that from general and universal principles, and the argument from implicit knowledge. Make a note of where these are found in the text so that you can review them all carefully. So if we agree with Locke that innate ideas aren't worth the trouble, what are we left with? His alternative to an epistemology that includes innate ideas is presented in Chapter 1, sections 1 through 5. If there are no pieces of knowledge that we're born with, Locke says, then we're born with minds that are white paper, void of all characters. And of course, this is the famous tabula rasa idea of Locke's. In his question, how comes the mind to be furnished? He's really creating a whole new area of philosophy, and that is the philosophy of education. Well, Locke thinks that the mind is furnished with ideas from two different sources. First, our senses conversant about particular sensible objects do convey into the mind several distinct perceptions of things, and thus we come by those ideas we have of yellow, white, heat, cold, soft, hard, bitter, sweet, and all those which we call sensible qualities. These are ideas from sensation. And note how they're not ideas of things, like a rock or an apple, but rather ideas of qualities of things. Things are built up in our experience from these qualities, according to Locke. But we're also furnished with what he calls ideas from reflection, or the perception of the operations of our own minds within us as it is employed about the ideas it has got. And such are perception, thinking, doubting, believing, reasoning, knowing, and willing. Whereas we might call our ability to get ideas from sensation through the five senses perception, we're also aware that we are perceiving, as well as imagining and hoping, etc. And this also gives us ideas. Each of the sensible qualities Locke lists as examples, as well as those functions of the mind that seem distinct, like remembering and anticipating, are what he calls simple ideas. Again, in Book 2, chapters 2 through 7, we get a better idea of what Locke means by simple ideas. When you think of an apple, like the varieties shown here in the background, you can describe its essential qualities in terms of color, shape, smell, taste, and touch. If the object makes a sound, then hearing is involved as well. Although the qualities we sense are, as Locke says, united and blended in the things themselves, They produce ideas in the mind that enter by the senses, simple and unmixed. Given all this, perhaps Locke's most revolutionary idea, an idea that certainly would not have occurred to Descartes or Leibniz, is that simple ideas are the most basic building blocks of experience. Everything we know, we remember, or even that we imagine, can be traced to simple ideas of reflection or sensation, as this quote from Book 2, Chapter 2 indicates. To sum up, here's part of a diagram that I'll reveal more fully in the next presentation, a presentation which is about complex ideas and how Locke's theory explains the way in which we acquire knowledge. The most basic elements of Locke's theory of ideas are shown here in their relationships to each other. The mind is a blank slate or tabula rasa, which from birth, or perhaps even before birth, is gaining simple ideas of sensation from the world. And after a while, it gains ideas of reflection from itself. In a third video in this sequence on empiricism in general, we'll look at the way in which the human mind can be said to represent the sensible world.